Richard Hastings sank into his leather armchair as the waiter filled another glass of whiskey. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in New Orleans, and he liked it there, surrounded by other influential businessmen, men who laughed loudly and talked about money as if it were just a game. Everything there reeked of power: the fine wood furniture, the golden gleam of the crystal goblets, the dishes served with the precision of a Swiss watch. It was a world where everything had a price, where every gesture and every word were invisible transactions. In the corner, Clara was discreetly clearing an empty table. She kept her eyes down, avoiding any eye contact with the customers. Not because she was shy, but because she had learned early on that for a young black woman working among rich white men, being invisible was a form of security. She knew this type of man. She knew their voices, their exaggerated laughter, their gazes that weighed on her not as if they were looking at a person, but at something smaller. But that night, she couldn't avoid Richard's gaze. He was watching her with a smile that mixed boredom and amusement, a smile Clara knew well, the smile of someone about to turn someone else into entertainment. He drummed his fingers on the table and looked at the piano in the corner of the restaurant. The shine of the black varnish reflected off the soft lights in the room. Then he picked up $100 bill and held it up between his fingers like a lure. "You there, girl?" His voice cut through the air, attracting stares from all around. "I know you've got music in your blood. How about playing something for us?" The laughter of her friends soon followed, and Clara's heart squeezed in her chest. She felt her blood freeze in her veins. She felt glances pass through her, waiting to see her reaction. The whole restaurant hung back, not out of respect, but for the sheer pleasure of the spectacle. They wanted to see how far Richard would go. They wanted to see how far Clara would go. She looked at the $100 bill he held between his fingers. A piece of paper which, for Richard, was a simple whim, but which for her could pay bills, lighten the load of life a little. But she knew that if she took that money, she would be selling something other than her talent. She would be selling her dignity. Because he didn't want to listen to music. He wanted to see a show where he owned the stage and she was the attraction. If he said no, he could lose his job. If he said yes, he'd become the joke of the night. The silence was heavy. Richard's gaze was a challenge. The muffled laughter of the other men was a warning. And Clara, standing in the middle of that hall, knew that any choice she made would change the course of that night and perhaps her whole life. Clara took a deep breath. The $100 bill still fluttered between Richard's fingers, an invitation disguised as generosity, but which was actually a trap. The whole restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. The wine glasses raised, the eyes attentive, the smiles disguised, everyone waiting to see the outcome of the spectacle Richard had set up. She could feel the stares piercing her skin, some of them full of pity, others of morbid curiosity, and the worst of them, amusement. No matter her response, she knew that, for those men, she had already lost. But then something changed inside her. A spark. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother singing softly as she washed clothes, her soft voice cutting through the silence of the simple house where she grew up. Or maybe it was the memory of her father, a man who never had anything, but who never bowed to anyone. If they want a show, thought Clara, I'll give them something they'll never forget. She walked slowly to the piano, feeling the weight of the stairs. Each step seemed to echo across the polished wooden floor. Richard smiled, satisfied, convinced that he had won. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and looked around, as if to say, "See how easy it is." Clara slid her fingers over the keys, feeling the softness of the ivory. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the world around her to disappear. Her breathing steadied, and her muscles relaxed. Then she began to play. The first notes came out low, hesitant. But soon his music began to fill the room, growing, expanding, taking over every corner of the space. It wasn't just any melody. It wasn't the kind of music these men were used to hearing in the sophisticated clubs they frequented. It was something pure, something that came from a much deeper place. The music told a story of pain, of struggle, of hope. A story of entire generations who never had a voice, but who carried an indestructible strength in their souls. Each note was an unshed tear, a contained cry, a dream that refused to die. The hall was filled with a heavy silence, a silence that no one expected. There was no more laughter, no more condescending smiles, just a collective shiver running down the spine of every person present. And Richard, he still held the $100 bill between his fingers, but now his hands were shaking. The smug smile had disappeared from his face. His eyes were fixed on Clara, but not with contempt, not with arrogance. He was, for the first time in a long time, speechless. And it was only the beginning. Clara's melody had transformed the hall. What had once been just a cruel game played by a bored man had become something much bigger. The music flowed like a river of uncontained feelings, flooding every corner of the restaurant. The older customers seemed to travel back in time, lost in memories they didn't even know still existed. Some closed their eyes, feeling each note vibrate in their souls. Others just stared at Clara, dumbfounded, as if they were facing something they couldn't explain. But the most striking was Richard. The man who had always had control over everything, over business, over people, over destinies, was now immobile. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something he himself couldn't define. His fingers still held the $100 bill, but his hand was now tense, sweaty. He wanted to say something, anything, but he couldn't. Each chord seemed to dismantle him from the inside, tearing away layer after layer of the armor he had been wearing all his life. And then Clara did something unexpected. She began to sing. Her voice was soft, but it carried centuries of pain, of hope, of resistance. It wasn't just a song. It was a cry for freedom, living proof that talent and dignity could not be bought or ridiculed. The words came out full of emotion, as if each verse were a testimony to all the injustices he had suffered. Then something unthinkable happened. A silent tear slid down Richard's cheek. He tried to hide it. He wiped his face quickly, looked around to see if anyone had noticed. But it was too late. It wasn't just him. In different parts of the restaurant, watery eyes reflected the impact of what they were witnessing. The music wasn't just beautiful. It was transformative. And Richard knew at that moment that he would never look at the world in the same way again. When Clara played the last note, the silence was absolute. For a moment, no one knew what to do. No applause, no murmurs. Just a heaviness in the air, as if everyone was trying to absorb what they had just felt. And that's when Richard did something no one expected. He stood up slowly, walked over to Clara, and without saying a word, placed the $100 bill on the piano. But it wasn't a gesture of arrogance. It was no longer a game. His gaze said it all: respect, admiration, and perhaps even regret. Clara looked at him without anger or resentment, just firm. She knew she had won, but not in the way Richard had planned. And then for the first time that night, Clara smiled. And with that smile, she ended her performance in the most powerful way possible, by leaving without taking the money. The room remained silent as Clara stood up. Richard's eyes were still fixed on her, but now there was no more arrogance, just an emptiness filled with something he couldn't name. It was as if, for the first time in his life, he had been forced to look beyond himself. Clara slid her fingers across the polished wood of the piano one last time, before turning and walking towards the exit. Her posture was upright, her expression serene, but her heart was pounding. Not from fear or humiliation, but from a victory that few would understand. Richard was still holding the $100 bill, now forgotten on the piano. The gesture that once carried debauchery and power had become something small, insignificant. He swallowed, feeling the weight of something new: shame. But not public shame, which he had always been able to circumvent with jokes and money. It was something deeper, an internal crack, a discomfort that he knew wouldn't go away anytime soon. Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already said everything she wanted to say with her music. As she passed through the doors of the restaurant, she felt the cool night air touch her skin and smiled slightly. Not because she had humiliated Richard, but because she had proved something much greater. Talent, dignity, and truth cannot be bought or reduced to a cruel game. Inside, the customers began to murmur. Some still seemed in a trance. Others looked at each other, as trying to process what they had just witnessed. And Richard, he just stood there staring at the piano, as if he expected to hear the music once again. But Clara had already gone, and the lesson she left behind would echo for a long time to come. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.